One of the primary aspects of my approach is personality psychology, in particular the Big Five model. And the assessment that I prefer to use is the Big Five aspect scale. This can be found on several websites. If you would to do a Google search of Big Five personality, particularly Big Five aspect scale, you'll find those sites. Um, if I had one to suggest, and I'm in no way affiliated with this site, is understandmyself.com. And one of the reasons I prefer that site is because they like to provide your personality profile in percentiles rather than scores, because they have a very large database of tens of thousands of people, and that provides some pretty useful reference points. And so with percentiles, you understand yourself in relation to your peers. And why is that useful? Well, it's useful because as you attempt to understand yourself, and hopefully, ideally, with the aim of broadening yourself so that you can more successfully navigate the world, whether it's the particular environment you're in or other people whose personalities may differ from yours. And so those percentiles really give you a good idea of sort of where you measure up to people. And the better you understand that, the more you're able to understand what you're contending with in relationships and environments. And so that's important, because well, let's just say I'm a fairly disagreeable person, which agreeableness is one of the Big Five traits, and I'm married to someone who is rather high in agreeableness. Well, one of the hallmarks of the trait agreeableness is, whether you negotiate for yourself or negotiate for others. And so the higher in agreeableness that you are, the more proclivity you have to negotiate for others. And the more disagreeable you are, the higher the proclivity to negotiate for yourself. And there's value in both of those ends of the spectrum. And so if you look at that, wherever you fall on the spectrum, kind of indicates the degree to which you negotiate for others or negotiate for yourself. And so if I'm married to someone as a disagreeable person to someone who's rather high in agreeableness, what you can generally gather from that is that I might have a stronger proclivity to negotiate for myself, and my wife would have a high proclivity to negotiate for others. And so, like, in that marriage, who is being negotiated for the most? And generally speaking, that's going to be me. And well, you can see how that might not go too well in a marriage, or at some point it's going to catch up with you. And so, because what that says is that I'm getting my needs met more than she is. And it's understandable if you look through the framework of personality, particularly that trait, agreeableness. So, what does that tell you? It's like, all right, so how do you optimize that marriage given those personality differences? And that's where the notion of broadening those traits come in, because if we just continue down that path, then we are invariably going to not only continue to run into conflict, but I think that conflict is going to become more and more compounded over time. And that's problematic, and you can see how at some point that really could lead to thinking that maybe we're just too incompatible and divorce is in order. But the thing about personality is that it really does describe characteristics, but it also describes behaviors. And the good thing about that is we know we can modify behavior. So in this sense, what that would indicate is, well, I could begin learning how to be more thoughtful, to be more considerate of my wife's needs. And so what that would ensure, in theory here, is that more of her needs would begin to be met. And you can imagine the more that your needs go unmet, the more frustrated you become over time, and maybe even eventually bitter and resentful. And so it's like, if I begin to negotiate for her needs more, well, more of her needs are probably going to be met, so there's going to be less frustration, less temptation for bitterness and resentment, and there's probably going to be some gratitude. And beyond that, she's probably going to want to reciprocate that with love and appreciation. And so one of the things to understand with that too is it takes two to tango, right? And so what she could do is, well, she could begin learning how to negotiate for herself, to say no, to, well, put herself first sometimes, right? Or at least more often than what she does. And, well, you can imagine that's going to enable her to have more of her needs met. And so you can imagine that as the, I don't know, you might call it equity of met needs begins to achieve more balance. And so I think there's less conflict in that area. But I think the most important aspect of this, from the high level view here, is like, what's really happening when you do that, especially when both people broaden their personality traits, given how there might be a clash within those that causes conflict and maybe even compounded conflict over time. And what's happening there is that you are becoming compatible, because I believe that conflict is really an opportunity to become more compatible, because what conflict does is expose incompatibility. And so you encounter something, you're not on the same page, here's a clash, here's a conflict. Well, what this says is that you're incompatible with this particular kind of issue. Now, I think those issues can be rather specific, say about finances with household items, right? I mean, just to really kind of get a little detailed there. But I think it can also be pretty generalized too, with just like with the example of agreeableness, with whose needs are getting met the most, and how that might be attributed to personality differences and, say, the trait agreeableness. And so, and what that also tells you, I mean, this really gets into a pretty deep subject here, but it's like, well, what is marriage? What are relationships for? And I do believe that, in generally speaking here, not to get too far down the rabbit hole with, marriage, I guess, but I believe that relationships are sets of limitations that are placed on each other, and while they do create constraints, I think those limitations, those constraints, they sort of force you to be precise with who you are and your character and your behaviors and your decisions and even what you say. And I think in doing that, that's really helps you to develop yourself better. And so you could say that that's where psychological development takes place. And you might even say spiritual development, because what tends to happen is that some of the most meaningful aspects that prior to those limitations only existed as potential now can be manifested. They could sort of be activated, if you will. And so, and if we don't have those limitations that sort of force that out, so to speak, then we may miss out on those most meaningful and important aspects of ourselves. And so a big part of that is, well, so I have to learn how to get along with you, right? And you can really understand that through personality. And so with the example of agreeableness there, it's like, all right, so there are some things that will inevitably occur to us, will present itself to us. Some areas of incompatibility, some topics or specific areas of incompatibility. And what are we going to do when we encounter those? And so if we are to sort ourselves out with that, so to speak, if we're to figure out how to get along with that, then that really sort of forces me outside my natural proclivities, right? And you can understand that very much so through your personality. And so it's like, well, if I can learn to operate within the bounds of this relationship and allow the limitations of this relationship to only allow the most, well, exactly what's needed in that relationship, or at least that particular aspect or situation that's sort of the source of the current conflict. And so what happens is that I try some things, and behaviorally here, right? Like I'm going to try a different approach. I'm going to try to say something different. I'm going to try to say something in a different way, and maybe I'm going to come up with a different idea altogether. Or maybe I'm just going to try something that's just outright outside of my normal range of behaviors and approaches. And really it's sort of experimental in a sense, because it's, let me try this and see if this works. Let me try this and see if this helps me to operate more optimally within the bounds of this relationship. And relationally, what you might say is that it's like, let me see if this behavior, if this approach is appreciated and effective for the other person, right? And if they can appreciate that and receive that, and if that seems to work for them, then you might be onto something. Well, I will say that you probably need to be able to do that without sacrificing your own self-respect. So this really squeezes you into a pretty tight spot sometimes, because it's like, well, how can I reach a workable compromise here? How can I operate within the bounds of this relationship, given the other person's personality, wishes, desires, needs, while not sacrificing mine either? And too often do we prematurely decide that that's not possible. And then we begin to look at incompatibility as an indication that this relationship isn't going to work. And so, well, that can lead to all kinds of destructive things. But I think if we adopt the attitude of, well, okay, this may seem difficult or even impossible to reconcile, but surely there's a way. And I think that if we push ourselves, and especially understanding the framework that I'm speaking to right here, is that we'll find a way, and we'll figure out how to work with each other. And as a result of that, we've developed ourselves better. We've broadened our personality, and the other person has too. And then what happens through that is that you've learned how to get along within that area of the relationship, and so that is becoming more compatible. And so that's sort of the idea. You might say that maybe that's the orientation. That could be our North Star, is to say, well, how do we become compatible? And that also means that you understand and accept the notion that that maybe we are somewhat compatible to start off with, but who knows how incompatible we are. And maybe what committing to relationships is, in a sense, is I'm going to commit to you to become compatible with you. I'm going to commit to become compatible with you, right? And well, that's because I'm not very compatible with you yet, but I think I could be. And so, of course, you're going to run into to conflict, but what that is well, it's just exposes your incompatibility. Therefore, it's an opportunity. So there's a lot of utility in understanding your personality. And so it's not just this fun personality assessment that you take so you can share with your friends and be able to somewhat sound more interesting because you can describe yourself in a particular way. In fact, I'll say a lot of people's experience, and I've even had this with myself sometimes, is that it can feel a little unpleasant because it's pretty revealing, and it's not just this feel-good sort of personality profile that you get with this assessment. So, but it can be very eye-opening, and so in some sense, it's like, if it's not offensive, are you really looking at yourself? And so. So there's some real utility in that, right? Because if I can discover the faults of my personality, then maybe I can learn to guard against them and sort of begin to to master my personality in a sense where I can, well, know when I need to do what. So it's, again, with, say, the trait agreeableness, it's if I work to broaden myself within the bounds of relationships, what happens is I learn when to be a little more agreeable than I normally am. And that can take me a long way because I get along with people more. But I'm also learning how to do that without sacrificing my self-respect. And what that also says is that it makes me even more of a master of knowing when I need to be disagreeable. And so that when I find myself in a situation that calls for that, then it's also very easy for me to do that. So personality is very much a big part of my approach. For that very reason, it does provide something very tangible and practical for us. But as you can see, if you just unpack that a little bit, you really begin to see some nuance in the utility of that. So if you're interested in working with me at all, particularly understanding your personality and how that might really assist you in developing yourself and improving relationships around you, whether they're personal relationships or business relationships, there's just kind of a limitless value that you can encounter that, because we are pretty complex beings, and I think the more that we learn about ourselves, the more that we can learn about human nature and learn how to navigate that with more success.